Welcome back to the Sermon Notes Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Ball, and with me today is David Hanna, the campus and teaching pastor at the church at Lockeland Springs. Jay is out of town again this week at the Southern Baptist Convention, but he'll be back with us next week. This season, we're walking through the entire Bible chronologically across all of the Brentwood Baptist campuses. And this week, we'll continue walking through the life of Solomon and the book of Ecclesiastes. But before we get to that, David, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that I get to be here, Brian.
It's been a minute since we've seen each other.
It has been a minute since we've seen each other.
It's been a minute. Well, how are things going? Tell us how the Lord is at work in the church at Lockeland Springs.
Oh, gosh. In so many tangible ways. As you know, we get to the honor of serving a really cool, dynamic neighborhood there in East Nashville. And over the last couple of years, since tornado that really destroyed much of our building and our neighborhood, then followed by the pandemic, obviously. About 2 years post that, we started to see a foundation reform, and at that point, it was formed on the back of several years of history, of shared experiences, of service, of tragedy, and getting to kind of build on that for these last couple of years. There's a stability and there are some roots that are planted that we haven't seen in the 7 years that we've been there, and it is so exciting to get to serve that congregation.
One, it's wonderful when you see adversity, right, and see the Lord work through adversity to draw people, because he does that so often. That's just what a beautiful story.
It really is to be able to call back to what God did in those places, and we were all there to witness it, which is that
shared experience.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, how is reading through the Bible going? Have you seen the effects of reading through the Bible at your campus?
No, is it? I mean,
we do this Bible thing.
What's that? Absolutely, it has been transformational.
Praise God.
Honestly, for me, for my small group, but especially for our congregation as a whole, I don't think all of our congregations have done this, but we shifted our entire 2024 calendar to the reading through the Bible, including all of our small groups.
Wonderful.
Every single group that meets is walking through this together. We create special meals once a month where the entire congregation comes together, just open forums to ask the questions that just desperately need to be asked.
Fantastic.
To really borrow each other's perspectives and perceptions. It's been beautiful to see hallway conversations, people that aren't in the same small group, people that don't interact very much, to say, good grief, did you read
what they did?
Did you read what they just did? Which has created this amazing unity and suddenly the ability to start to pull some of these meta-narrative threads through together as a congregation has really been transformational.
That's
for us.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's just, again, another shared experience, right?
Absolutely.
And so you take that shared lived experience and then the shared word experience, and beautiful, beautiful things happen.
Isn't that awesome?
Beautiful, beautiful. That's just fantastic. That's just so exciting. That's really, really cool. And so today we're still in scene 5, right? The kings and prophets, where God shapes the kingdom, and we're in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. We did a little bit of the wisdom literature with Wade last week.
Sure.
Going to do some of the kind of closing of the wisdom literature here. I
feel like Wade may be better at wisdom than I am.
I think you're both just fine. I'm just here to smile, as I've told you. But it's really interesting to look at the life of Solomon, because he's a very different king than David was.
Sure.
Because he comes on the heels of David and as David's son through Bathsheba, and we see that when we look at the books, the narratives we have in Kings and Chronicles, right? Kings was written closer as a historical narrative, closer to the time of the events,
right?
And Chronicles is kind of a puff piece.
It really does seem as though the life and reign of Solomon is almost whitewashed in Chronicles.
It absolutely
so many
is.
of those things that the hallway conversations happen about.
Right.
Can you believe this?
Right.
Chronicles just kind of rolls right past them.
That's exactly. Well, and you get, right, they're coming back. It's probably written when they're coming back from exile, and so they're trying to reinforce the Davidic line and the promise through the Davidic line. But it's still fascinating, right, to see what's left out. And that's what's beautiful about reading this chronologically, is we see these parallel accounts. And you get to see what's in one and not in the other.
Completely, from completely different perspectives. Yep. All truth,
right?
But it is fascinating to see what's put in, what's left out, and it's so imperative to recognize the context into which it was written.
That's right.
The audience it was written to, then you're like, okay, I absolutely see why they took this angle because of what they were trying to do.
Exactly, right. Good hermeneutics.
Or what God was doing through this.
Right, right. Well, and it's good hermeneutics, right, which are a $5 word for how we read and understand the Bible. And we do that in the totality of Scripture. And so that way it gives us context for reading these stories, reading these events. I know that you kind of went from the beginning in your sermon yesterday, right?
I did. I mean, you want to talk about a quick flyby from Adam and Eve all the way up to the temple.
Right.
But I felt it's such a watershed moment in the history of God's people when Solomon builds this temple. You have to remind each other of that history, how we got here, because the temple is not just a building.
Right. That's exactly right.
It is so easy to really take that perspective. As we all sit in sanctuaries every Sunday morning, it is easy to think, wow, that was just a really elaborate, cool sanctuary.
Yeah, not so much. It was a materialized promise of God.
Absolutely.
Right. And when you think of that as a materialized promise of God, that makes that building so, and that's why we have all this incredible detail, right? We had all incredible detail back in the Torah, back in the Pentateuch, right? And now we've got all that detail coming to life, literally, in what Solomon does. But before Solomon got there, right, there was a rival king that raised himself up, as it were.
Sure.
That said, I think I'll be king.
Well, and in these first couple of chapters of First Kings, where you see the transition from David to Solomon, and this kind of bloody feud over the throne between two brothers, it's a rough passage to read.
It is.
And there are even questions about how Solomon does end up rising to king.
Right.
With Bathsheba and Nathan, and there seemed to be some plotting and some scheming and maybe even some deception, maybe even some taking advantage of David in his later stages of life.
Right.
Who knows what his mental state was at the time.
Right.
It does beg a lot of questions. I think they're really important questions. It's so important, though, to be reading this in the context of the entire Scripture, because you do see that Davidic line.
That's exactly right. And that's what and we see God's promise in that, right? And his brother, and it was interesting to see Solomon's mercy on his brother, right? Because when Solomon ascends to the throne, he says, if you do well, you'll live. If you don't, you won't.
And he kept to his word.
He did. He absolutely kept to his word. But that was an interesting thing of mercy instead of just obliterate. Because most of the time, those kings would just obliterate any rival that would threaten them.
Which seems to be, again, this is something that's left out in Chronicles, but you see it in Kings. Seems to be David's advice. His final words to his son are, "Hey, here are some of your rivals. I gave them a promise that I was going to protect them.
Right.
You
not so much.
To.
Right.
And it seems vengeful, but you also realize that it's a matter of protection.
Right, and a matter of unity.
It's absolutely. This is the way you unify the line, you unify the kingdom, you unify the crown, all under the Davidic line and the promise that God made to me so many years ago.
Right, and this is certainly under the old covenant, not under the new covenant. Another place to understand that we should not go out and take out our rival pastors or churches would be a bad plan. So
is that not?
That's not what we do.
Oh gosh, I need to change my goals.
I know. And it was for 2025 too. So that was the exciting part. But then Solomon did ascend, right? And we see this beautiful, right? Because God gives him, and Jay preached a couple weeks ago about a blank check, right? God gives him a blank check. Says, "What do you want?" And Solomon asked for wisdom to lead his people. And God blesses that and says, not only will you have that, but you'll have all of these other things added to you. And we see that wisdom demonstrated when a child is brought forth.
Right, almost the immediate passage right after that. It's this display of what can only be called godly wisdom.
That's exactly right.
I love this passage in 1 Kings 3 where Solomon and the Lord do have this conversation. And Solomon gets this blank check.
Right.
What would you like? To me, the request for wisdom is born almost out of a desperation. Right. As the crown is finally secured, the rivals have been eliminated. The kingdom is united under his rule, and suddenly you can sense this moment that Solomon realizes, all right, now I've actually got to lead.
Right.
And I have no idea.
Right. The dog caught the car.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And out of that, which is an incredible kind of introspective self-realization of, I can't do this. No one can do this.
Right.
So God, if you're going to give me anything, give me your wisdom so that I can lead your people. And it really is a beautiful moment.
Absolutely. And you see that played in even through the building of the temple, because
Sure.
he understands that no building is going to contain God.
Right.
Right. And he says all those things explicitly, that,
Sure.
but this is what you have called me to do. And we do see the presence of God come down, right? And
Absolutely.
He's obviously not limited geographically in any way, but we see his presence be specifically at the temple for specific things he calls his people to do in worship.
Sure.
Right? For prayer, for sacrifice, as Solomon said in his dedication of the temple and prayer for the temple. This is what we do here.
Well, and of course, all of this, a callback kind of the tabernacle and God's presence in the tabernacle, obviously not contained in the tabernacle, but in the middle of his people,
right.
Always in the middle of the camp.
Yep.
The center of his people, but with his people not able to actually enter into his presence,
right.
Which all leads us to the cross and the veil and everything else. It really is an incredible reminder of some of these meta narratives,
yep.
and of God's plan and design to bring us back into his presence.
Well, and his people were all organized around the presence of God.
Sure.
Right, when it was in the tabernacle. The
Yep.
people of God were organized around the presence of God.
And these passages, I'm so sorry, now I'm getting excited.
That's what this is here for.
And going all the way back into Exodus and Mount Sinai and the tabernacle and the organization of the various tribes and where they lined up. And then you see the organization of the temple and the way it's all put together.
Yep.
You see the divine order in it all.
Yep.
Which is
Yep.
It's not arbitrary.
Nope.
It's not just to be, opulent or over the top, and we're going to show the world how. No, the divine order is beautiful.
Yep.
When you can sit down and look at the big picture.
And under the new covenant, there's a new order,
Yeah.
right, that Jesus comes and brings, and we see that same thing. And so our lives, right, should be arranged around the presence of God in Christ.
Absolutely.
And so he gives us a new center.
Sure.
Well, it's always been God, right? We now have God with us.
Right.
So beautiful. I'm sorry. We're getting
No,
ahead
you're
of ourselves. All right. So Solomon took all of this opulence to a pretty extreme degree. And so Deuteronomy 17, right, told us what a king should do. And we don't have any record of Solomon writing the law, which is the first thing a king was supposed to do, was write a copy of the law. And we see him, and I believe he is disobedient to every one of the measures in Deuteronomy 17.
Every single one.
And it's amazing someone this wise would be this foolish, right? But one of the things he didn't have was the presence of a prophet. And when we look back and see what the prophetic voice did for David, right? When we look at what Samuel played for Saul,
Sure.
right? That's a big hole that nobody is smart enough or wise enough to fill.
And it is the gift of this godly wisdom. It really almost becomes a two-edged sword.
That's right.
Solomon doesn't need anyone else, right? Because everyone's coming to him.
That's right.
For the wisdom, for the knowledge, for the answers. You got Queen Sheba rolling up and asking all the questions, and Solomon can answer all of them. Well, at what point does he kind of make that turn of, I don't need a prophet?
Right.
Who's going to tell me?
Right. That's exactly right.
And you can definitely see that begin to spiral pretty quickly.
When you see it in getting the horses from Egypt, all of the women, right, that start to lead, he starts building, the temple, the worship implements, right, of all these foreign wives, because we have Josiah coming in and tearing them all down, late in 2 Kings.
Right.
But so we see what all was built with Solomon that his wives and Solomon didn't ever appear to reject God outright. Didn't appear to, but God just started to fade into all of these other things, and he started worshiping other gods. And
God became just another part of his life.
That's right.
As opposed to his life being consumed.
Right.
It's almost as though humanity continues to struggle with some of the...
It's shocking. It's shocking. Well, we taught Deuteronomy for 5 years to young adults. And one of the things, after the first couple of weeks, they were like, what on earth are you doing? Mm-hmm. And after about the fourth or fifth week, they were like, this is truer today than when Moses spoke. It's like, sure, we haven't changed, right? Human beings are the same nasty things they were back when we fell. But the Lord is equally merciful, right? And the Lord continues to seek and come for us and graciously accept us. And not only accept us, but sacrifice so we can be accepted.
Praise be.
I mean, I don't know what else. It's kind of, what else do you want from these things?
No spoilers, because I know we're going to get to Ecclesiastes in a minute. At least I think we do.
We are.
If we've got time.
We're headed that way.
Anytime I read Ecclesiastes, I think this could have been written last week.
Right. That's
by
right.
Probably anyone sitting in our pews.
Right. That's exactly right.
3,000 years.
That's right.
We have learned nothing.
Yeah. And we just have more technological ways of accomplishing evil faster and more widespread.
Yeah. We're pretty good at it.
We're fantastic, and we continue to get better, unfortunately. But that's where this golden age, right? The people look back and often in Solomon as this golden age with wisdom and opulence and all these things, but it lands in a divided kingdom. It lands in that unity that the Lord brought before him is shattered in disobedience. And we see that in our life. And we see people who are very gifted, right? A lot of the people that live in North Nashville, the people that live in Brentwood, have been given magnificent gifts by the Lord for the kingdom service. And often we start becoming, as Solomon did, amazed by the gift instead of the giver.
Sure.
Right?
And we begin to build our places of worship to these things.
That's right. And to ourselves. Yeah, that's one of the conversations I had with Michael Boggs is, why do they so many of these worship songs go, me, Jesus? Yeah. It's like, that's not about Jesus. And you see that in different forms. Sure. Right? You see that in different forms of preaching. You see that in different forms of worship. You see that in different forms of church activities. That it's almost glorifying to the church or glorifying to the name of people, as opposed to glorifying to the Lord.
It's still that come and see model of we can build it bigger and better here. Right. And eventually the world will come to us. But if they don't, that's fine, because we have everything we need.
Exactly.
Everything we need.
Right, exactly. Right. But we also have what they need. And that's the tragedy, right, is that we don't take what they need to them. And that's what's so broken.
There's your Matthew 28 go and tell model.
That's exactly
the complete
right.
shift. Right.
That's exactly right. And so we go and do these. That's beautiful. That's awesome. All right, so let's go to Ecclesiastes, we often start these books walking through a compass, right? So we kind of go with the who, when, what, and so King Solomon wrote this probably late in his life. And it was a book containing reflections of a man who had played the fool, who had it all and lost it all, and then discovered what was worth having anyway. That was Tommy Nelson of The Problem of Life with God. Okay. And I love that we see the progress of people in the Bible. Like Paul, you see him in Galatians going, we need to go castrate somebody, to Romans and this beautiful, smooth prose. We see his maturity develop as a believer. We also see that in Solomon, right? We see the eros of his early writings in the Song of Solomon. Sure. We see Proverbs coming out in his midlife. And then we see Ecclesiastes coming out at the end. And so we see that shift in perspective, that maturing and to a tragic level in Solomon.
It really is kind of a tragic level. I would contend the biggest tragedy is the fact that Solomon lived this life, gained this wisdom, was able to give us the wisdom he learned through these experiences, and yet we have to do the same thing Solomon did. We can't just be like, oh, wow, this actually makes great sense.
Right.
I'm just going to jump to the end.
Right.
We have to walk through those first 11 chapters to get to chapter 12 in our own life, because it's that experiential learning.
That's exactly right. Well, and it's how because that's where God walks with you. Right, God doesn't. I mean, because and Mike always used to say this, right? You're coming up on a tragedy, and you want God to pick you up, put you on the other side, and go, "Phew, that was close."
Right.
But He doesn't do that. He walks through these things with you. Right. So one, you can learn the wisdom of God, and two, you learn where to place fear. Yeah. That we fear God and we don't fear anything else, because God always has you wherever you're walking. God had Solomon, and that's what he ceased to realize, was that it was God doing these things, not Solomon doing these things. And you see that in Ecclesiastes, right? All of these things are vanity, right? Is the one of the
chasing the wind,
right? And you're just everything, and all of these, and he lists everything we go chase after.
Sure.
I mean, there was a comprehensive list of what he lists out there of everything that we chase after today, and none of it matters, right, if it's not done to the glory of God.
Which is, I mean, you see it time and time again. You see it story after story after story. Modern celebrities, CEOs, business magnates, in an interview at some point. I remember famously Tom Brady after one of his Super Bowl trophies. They asked how it felt, and he said, "Is this really it?
Right.
Is this really it?"
Right.
And then we take your chapters, Philippians 4.
Yeah.
Which that entire chapter is all about contentment and where you are.
Yep.
I have found the key to contentment and identity. It's Jesus Christ, so that I can be content whether I'm dining at the table of kings or I'm snake bit and shipwrecked.
Right.
And yet we turn it into eye black.
Right.
We turn it into
on your shoe.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. It's the thing, because what we turn, even this beautiful passage about contentment, which is almost a condensation of everything Solomon had learned that he's trying to impart in Ecclesiastes, we turn it into a means to get what we want, what we think is going to fill us up, what we think is finally going to give us identity or worth or value.
Yep.
When the only thing that can do that is our Creator.
That's right. Well, and I love Philippians, right, in that point toward him, where in the ESV translate says, "I have found the secret of facing plenty."
Which oftentimes is so much harder.
That's right. But
than scarcity.
That's what we're reading right now, right?
Sure,
is
exactly.
facing plenty. And Solomon failed in facing plenty. And yet Paul says, let me tell you, and that's where the end of Ecclesiastes gets us to. It's the same conclusion Paul draws
Absolutely.
to. And that's just beautiful, I think, to see those parallels. That's just awesome. That's just, okay, we've got to go our compass. We don't have
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, this is what we do. So this is all good. To whom it was written from Jerusalem, right? And it's probably the most philosophical book of the Bible. And it never uses the covenant name of God, Yahweh, which is, I think, fascinating.
It is fascinating.
And so this leads many scholars to believe that this book was written inherently with the unbeliever in mind. And think about that Scripture written specific, because so much of what we see is written to the believer, right? To those of us who believe, those who know. And this was almost specifically written going, let me tell you, I've done everything you're thinking about.
Right.
And let me tell you what the answer is. And he goes through an elaborate detail of this is all the way I failed.
You can almost sense the desperation in his writing.
Yep.
As though the people he is writing this to, he's saying, guys, you don't have to do this.
Right.
I have done that. I have walked that path. I know how that story ends. You don't have to.
Right.
So many of us still do.
Well, that's when we counsel married couples. We go through all the mistakes Rachel and I have made, and we say, these are our mistakes. Go make your own. Plenty out there for you.
Sure.
But we've already made these. Don't make these.
Right.
Go
That's
find
great.
some of your own. And that's a little of what Solomon's doing, is that, except his is more comprehensive. He's tried, I mean, you look at the power, the wisdom, the notoriety, the wealth, the material.
Right.
I mean, he kept having to build stuff to store the things he had. Right? I mean, kept building things just to store what he had. At that point, you should look in the mirror and go, maybe this is too much.
One thing Jay always points out is in 2020, during like the height of the pandemic, when everything was shutting down, when businesses were failing, when people were losing their homes, one of the few industries that didn't fail was storage units.
Right.
It increased exponentially because it's that thing of I can lose everything, but I'm not going to give up my stuff.
Right. That's exactly right. And we see that in Solomon, in how he clung to the things of the world. This is probably written toward the end, as we said, toward the end of his reign. It's a mixture of Hebrew poetry and prose. And Solomon is, I love this, overtly pessimistic about life under the sun, apart from God. And I don't know how you're anything else when you play it out to logical ends. And we can often use material things as almost an anesthetic. Right, it anesthetizes us from things, but the problem is it doesn't change the underlying condition, the underlying need, the underlying loss, the underlying desperation. While it can mask it, and sometimes even mask it from ourselves.
That's exactly what happens. Yeah.
Right, but it's still there. It doesn't treat the underlying condition because only Christ can do that. Can meet what we, and it's not even a hole. It's who you are. You are dead in your sin. and Christ brings life, right? Doesn't
It's
come
so
to
good.
what's that? Doesn't make bad people come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people live.
So it's so good,
And
so
that's
beautiful.
just a whole different thing.
Right.
And that's what we see here is life to death. And so, and that's, I think, and we probably need to move to the conclusions, but Ecclesiastes, I love what you're saying, especially where you're ministering. My sons are at fairly prestigious academic settings, and they deal with these things, because they're dealing with people that don't believe and are very sophisticated thinkers, very intelligent people, have a very well thought out way of looking at life. But it's interesting to watch the questions that he asks.
Well, it's fascinating because as you look at the story, and it's one reason I love reading through this Bible chronologically, because you can look at the story of Solomon as a whole, all together.
Right.
Like his life, his reign, his writings, his wisdom, and as you look at that, and you conclude with all of the lessons he had learned by the end of his life in Ecclesiastes, you're reminded that the first test of plenty that he failed was not success. It was not wealth. It was not women. It was not power. All those came.
Right.
It was wisdom.
Right.
And this idea of he had such a surplus of wisdom, he was blinded. He was anesthetized.
Yeah.
That he needed anybody.
Right.
He could do it all himself.
Right.
And then everything spirals from there. And so often in a lot of these settings, especially places, Middle Tennessee, Williamson County, it's this thing of, hey, I've got everything.
Right.
Everything I need, not only do I have, I've achieved.
Right.
And so who really can tell me anything?
Right.
I mean, God, yes, he's always going to be a part of all of this,
Sure.
but just when I've got time, when I need to pull him out, when I need to
at my convenience,
right. exactly. But at the end of the day, do I really need God? That's what we convince ourselves of.
Well, that's what Mike. When we first came, I asked Mike, "What do you see when you're looking at your ministry?" He said, "I have a whole city of rich young rulers." He said they've achieved everything materially that the world tells them they should do, and they're lost.
Yeah.
And they're empty, right?
Yeah.
And they don't know. And I saw that when my son was an undergrad, because they had achieved coming to this particular institution, and that was success. And then they were like, well, now what?
Sure.
What? Because
is this really it?
Is this really it? That's exactly right. And so I love it. And I love the way you phrase that. And that's really the question people ask that achieve these things. I love that you see that. And the other thing that we taught our boys was to be really careful as to what voices you listen to. And what Solomon did was he stopped listening to anybody's voice. You can also listen to wrong voices, right? You can have wrong voices, but it's very careful. But you need to have a carefully curated body of wise Christian, in our boys' case, men that speak in their life. They've got some women that speak into them, but dominantly just because they've walked some of the exact experiences that the boys have had that are advisors to them. And so we've curated and we've taught them how to curate what those voices are. And I think Solomon lost all of that in his self-importance, in his self-aggrandizement.
Sure.
And so those things are so important. And I know we can keep going on forever. Okay, let's go through this. We'll go through these takeaways. This is really awesome. Takeaways. All right. So the early part of Solomon's reign, right, was marked by blessing. And then the building of the temple was magnificent, right? And as we said, it's really God's promise materialized in a building. But then he forgot the source of the blessing, right? He forgot that this was God's work and not his work. And we do that. It can happen as a pastor. It can happen as a Bible teacher, right? That we forget that this gifting and this calling is not mine. Right, and that's what we prayed before this. Right, this is an offering. This podcast is an offering. Your sermons are offerings.
Beautiful.
Right, these are things for God to do with as He wills. Right, G.K. Chesterton said it's a lot easier to find someone to be a martyr than a fool. Right, because nobody wants to look like a fool.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And so will you be a fool for Jesus?
As you look through even those early days and years of Solomon's reign, even into the building of the temple, you can start to see some of the seeds.
Yep.
He's already marrying Pharaoh's wife.
Yep.
He's already kind of straying off some of the just black and white laws he had been given. When he builds the temple, it is beautiful, and it's this incredible offering to the Lord. At the same time, he spends more time building a bigger palace for himself.
Right.
one of the things I've loved walking through Solomon is kind of the comparing and contrasting of him and his father.
Yep.
Because let's not pretend David didn't have his own flaws.
Was not some kind of saint, right?
Flaws.
Absolutely.
Committed some horrific atrocities.
Yep.
And yet at each turn, always running back to his creator.
Yep.
From the very beginning, you see Solomon starting to make some of maybe the smaller mistakes without huge consequences, and never did he acknowledge that. Never does he turn.
Yep.
And the little ones turn into big ones. And next thing you know, he's down the road and he's on his own, convinced he can do it all himself.
That's right. And all of this, of course, points to the need for someone greater, right? And that's what we love from like Luke 11:31 says, right, the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment, and the men of this generation and condemn them. And for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. Right? And then over 1 Corinthians, Paul says, and because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Right? This is the greater. Solomon, as magnificent as the temple was, as mixed, it's nothing compared to Christ. Nothing compared to what he gives, right? Sure. His body is the temple, right? I will rebuild this temple in 3 days. And even his followers don't understand. They had to turn around and explain to them, going, I'm not going to rebuild the building. So, but I love what you talk about, the veil being torn, right? And that's a different, it's a different thing. Again, God could be anywhere, but it was symbolic of that separation. And so all of a sudden, Emmanuel, Christ is with us, right? God is with us. And we see this greater Solomon, this greater wisdom, and he indwells us.
Yeah. Well, and that's, Solomon's conclusion, the conclusion of his life, is fear the Lord.
Right.
That's the meaning of life. Right. That's it. You want to know the meaning of life? Right. There it is. And that idea of fear the Lord, it's this reverence, it's this awe. Yep. It's I believe it was Tim Keller, the bottom line rule of the Bible is recognition that there's a God and I'm not it.
Right.
That's the fear of the Lord. And so many of us can say those words, but live our life as though, no, I am the ultimate ruler. We lose that awe and that reverence.
Yeah, I've defined fear as ascribing power or authority to something, which is how you reconcile Isaiah 11:12. Isaiah 11 says, fear the Lord. Isaiah 12 says, don't be afraid. Yeah. Right? It says, ascribe all power and authority. Sure. And the question is, who do you actually live like you fear?
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Right? Who do you actually live like you fear? Do you fear God more? And the answer to us as Christians has to be yes. Because that's where all power and authority, whatever we're going through, whatever we're facing, plenty or want, right? God is greater. God is greater than anything we face. Yeah. That's just awesome. Man, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here.
So grateful for the invitation.
No, this is a blast. This is a blast. Well, that's it for today's episode of the Sermon Notes Podcast. We hope you found our discussion helpful, and if you did, would you help us out by leaving us a review on your podcast app or dropping a comment in the YouTube comments below? Thanks for watching and listening, and we'll see you next week.